Rishi Sunak has gained a reputation for spending big on furlough schemes, loans to businesses and billions for frontline medical services. Anything to fight the pandemic and protect the economy from its effects. On Wednesday, it was different. The first glimpse of the bill, and the numbers were grim.
The economy will contract this year by 11.3%, the largest fall in output for more than 300 years. As the restrictions are eased, they expect the economy to start recovering. Even with growth returning, our economic output is not expected to return to pre-crisis levels until the fourth quarter of 2022.
This year, the government will have to borrow $500 billion. And in 2025, the UK economy will still be 3% smaller than it would have been without the pandemic. Unemployment is expected to rise to 7.5% next year. That's 2.6 million people without jobs. This huge gap between revenues and spending will have to be filled with tax rises, but they will come next year. For now, there are pay rises for doctors and nurses, but none for other public sector workers. And the amount of money spent on overseas aid will be cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%. Election pledges to spend on infrastructure, schools, police and defence are being honoured, and there'll be no return to austerity. But this statement emphasises the massive burden of debt the British state is taking on.
Our health emergency is not yet over, and our economic emergency has only just begun.
This government has 4 years left till the next election. Those years will be dominated by how it manages a profound economic crisis. Simon McGregor-Wood, TRT World.
Well, joining us from London is Rajneesh Narula. He's a Professor of International Business Regulation at the University of Reading's Henley Business School. Welcome back to the program, Rajneesh. Now, Chancellor Rishi Sunak says the UK is forecast to borrow just over $500 billion this year, or 19% of GDP, which is the highest recorded level in peacetime. Is that too high a price to pay in order to deal with this pandemic?
Well, I think this is, I don't think this is too much. In fact, the spending is underestimated. I expect we'll spend much, much more than what they've actually envisaged. The problem, Oscar, here is really that after more than 10 years of austerity, where government has cut back on essential services, hospitals, police, education, and what have you, everything possible has been cut back to the bone. That there is no slack in government facilities, government organizations, and the ability to meet with an emergency. And of course, no one plans properly for an emergency. But in this case, there is absolutely no extra capacity in the system, and the system has been overwhelmed. This explains the really poor reaction to COVID and the crisis that was is associated with it. So we really are seeing a situation where the government has to rapidly build back government capacity to handle all of the areas of, as you know, education, police, hospitals, and so on. And this is really going to take a toll. So the price they're putting on this is actually fairly low.
Okay. Now, for the last year, Rishi Sunak really has been the bearer of good news. He announced that very expensive furlough scheme and several extensions after that. He also announced initiatives like the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which really helped prop up restaurants for the period of a couple of months. But now he's delivered some bad news in the form of spending cuts, including a public sector wage freeze, cuts to foreign aid spending for the first time in a decade. Do you believe, though, that deeper cuts are on their way?
Absolutely. There is no way to balance the books, and the cost to the taxpayer is going to be in a tight spot. We're going to see this. There isn't any other way around it. Tax revenues are dropping, obviously, because output is dropping across the board in every aspect. Let's not forget Brexit, which is upon us. And we're seeing a shrinking of traditional industries, or traditional like tourism, for instance, which was a big source of revenue. That's gone. So we're going to see this problem is how do you balance the books? So it's very unclear how they're going to pay for all of this as time goes on, but the costs are going to rise. It's a very unlikely scenario that there will be a recovery by 2022. I don't see how he came up with that particular number. I suspect we're going to be looking at the pandemic, the cost of pandemic feeding into 2023 and perhaps 2024 as well.
Interesting. Can I ask you about Brexit? Because the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that the already dire economic situation would be made even worse if the UK and Brussels don't come up with some sort of a trade deal before the transition period ends at the end of the year. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the two sides will actually agree on something before December 31st?
Well, you know, the game changed fundamentally when Biden got elected. I think that Johnson had depended on the idea that he would have a sweetheart deal with Trump, and this, to some extent, would mitigate the dangers of Brexit, the cost of no deal.
The UK, as was pointed out in Simon's package, isn't expected to return to pre-pandemic levels until the fourth quarter of 2022. You say that's a bit optimistic, I guess, in your previous comment. But is there anything more that the government should be doing in order to revive the economy so they can actually stick to that forecast?
Well, I think the only way really is long-term investments. The cost of Brexit and the pandemic are going to have significant shocks that we're not going to see a recovery till 2025. So I think now is the time to invest in public services, building up infrastructure, and human capital, investing in skills, because building all hospitals, building all of these things, we need people to run them. And there's a dire shortage of highly skilled people, especially after they'll be closing the borders and the movement of people from Europe to the United Kingdom will reduce quite drastically.
Okay, Rajneesh Narula from the Henley Business School, thank you for your analysis as always.